Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole. This is a Breitbart news production. And my special guest today, and I'm so excited, this is her return. I think, Claire, were you the... Well, you probably wouldn't know. I think you were my first ever podcast guest.
I think I might have been. First or second. I was in the early phase.
Yeah.
Outside a station in Birmingham.
You remember it well.
I do.
Well, since then, it's got really exciting. Several things have happened. One, the sound quality has got so much better. I mean, I'm not even sure that people will have... The listener, if there was one, will have heard what you were saying. And now we have a very loyal audience known as the special friend. There's a special friend who listens to this podcast from all around the world. And so welcome back. And basically, we can rehearse some of the stuff that we said before because hardly anyone will have heard it last time. And now, this is the podcast of podcasts. First of all, better explain who you are. I mean, you kind of think of yourself as a woman of the left, don't you?
I do indeed. I was formerly the publisher of LM magazine, which stood for Living Marxism, and a long-standing contributor to that magazine beforehand, and somebody who was involved in revolutionary communist politics for many a year. And I don't feel as though I've moved to the right, but I do feel as though the tags left and right have become increasingly meaningless.
I think we should talk about that more. But just in case anyone listening and going, oh my God, why is this communist on this podcast? I ought to say that Claire is just one of the people I would most like having in a foxhole next to me. We are fellow warriors in the culture wars, and there is so little on which I disagree with Claire. And Claire does this show on the BBC. I mean, I won't touch the BBC. I'd rather kind of feed my woolly into a Magimix, frankly. But Claire actually does a programme on the BBC called The Moral Maze, where you talk about what sort of moral issues.
Yes, the morality of the big questions of our day.
Yeah.
Allegedly.
So maybe you can help answer a question which is often puzzled me. People like you, Brendan O'Neill, Frank Furedi, Tiffany Jenkins, there's quite a few of you who came from that Living Marxism school, and I think all of you still identify as kind of Marxists, more or less.
Oh, I really can't speak on behalf of the others, but they broadly came out,
They haven't renounced it.
Yeah, no, they haven't renounced it.
So why is it that we get on so well, whereas, for example, let me just pluck an example from the air. Nicholas Soames, Shire's Tory MP, grandson of Winston Churchill, same sort of similar, much posher background than me, but that kind of private school, Oxbridge or whatever, Guards, whatever he did. He ought to be the sort of person that, as a conservative, I should be identifying with more. And yet, I feel so much more kinship with you. Now, why is that?
Well, I've no idea about your personal predilections, but I do think that the culture wars and the arguments around freedom have changed everything, and they have come much more to the fore in politics over the last 10, 15 years. And I suppose that in the context of that, even though this might be surprising for your listeners, some of us on the left were very worried about, for example, the state's growing incursions into people's private lives. I was writing about those kind of things in relation to education 20 years ago. I was actually saying that we had to be very careful about personal autonomy and personal freedom. If you're somebody like me who believes in the history-making potential and the agency of ordinary people, which is, good old Marxist idea, actually, then anything and the contemporary trends that basically say people are not up to it, are incapable of making decisions on their own, can't be trusted to listen to different opinions without being, easily swayed by one side or another, and so on and so forth. These things are an anathema to somebody like me. So, on that, I think we probably share a lot of an outcome, even though we come from very different trajectories. And those issues were less in the fore in the past than they are at the moment. So it's more that what the issues that we now end up discussing brings us together in a sort of a way. I mean, obviously, it's going to be terrible for my reputation that you say we have so much in common. But
No,
I was also going to say, I'm no longer fazed by that, because I think it's very important that one actually takes the arguments as they present themselves and discuss them as you genuinely believe in them, and not be frightened about some kind of guilt by association, or worried that people might think you're right wing, or don't know that you're left wing, or any of these things. I just happen to be left wing, but it doesn't matter.
But you said earlier, you made a very good point, I think, which is that left and right are not really helpful terms to describe where the political debate, or rather the divisions, the real divisions, are in the world right now. I mean, I read a piece about this for Breitbart, one of my kind of special intellectual pieces that I occasionally do, and a weekend job, long read. And I put it in terms of, for want of a better categorization, traditionalists versus postmodernists. Now, traditionalists look at the past not necessarily as an evil thing. Some traditions are useful. The canon is a kind of accepted hierarchy of the authors who are worth reading, yada, yada, yada. Men and women are different. So the things that previous generations would have taken for granted, that I don't know, the family is an important unit, that there were lots of assumptions that I grew up with, which are kind of looking at the world as it is. Contrasted with that is postmodernism, which is pretty much all that gets taught in universities nowadays, where it's not about empiricism, the things that we valued, that the Enlightenment philosophers taught us about. It's not about looking at the world as it is, but looking at the world via a particular narrative about oppressors and the oppressed, about identity politics. Do you find those definitions useful in any way?
I can relate to them. It's not entirely the way I understand things. I mean, first of all, I suppose I do consider myself very much to be a child of the Enlightenment, and that's the kind of great period historically that I have taken my intellectual inspiration from. And in fact, they weren't traditionalists, were they? So in the sense that they were overthrowing and so on, I don't often think of myself as a traditionalist. But where I think you're absolutely right is that it's hugely important to not be cavalier about tradition either. And you gave the examples in relation to the canon and the best that's known and thought, and that is absolutely coming in for a smashing. Never mind, the literal smashing of statues and so on. And some of these cavalier and Philistine attitudes to the past, to knowledge, to the great ideas of the philosophers from ancient Greece onwards, it seems to me are traditions I would defend. I mean, I don't know whether I call myself a traditionalist.
I think you've just put yourself in that camp.
No, but I'm also very enthusiastic about change. That was what I was going to say. And to use a contemporary example, when the arguments were happening in the UK about Brexit, and one of the arguments was, we cannot take this bold step of leaving the EU because, it'd be like jumping off a cliff.
Yeah.
And this whole sort of notion that we should retain the status quo, there is no alternative, we have to stand still, this is it, end of, put up, shut up. And actually, I thought that what was incredibly inspiring about that vote was to a certain extent, the courage and the bravery of millions of people who defied the establishment's let's not do this, it's too frightening, and took the leap, and did take the leap actually, despite the prejudices subsequently expressed. They did take the leap knowing that it was risky, knowing that there would be some costs and so on. But the reason I'm emphasising that is because I think at the moment there's a real discombobulation of politics, because we're living through a period of historic change, there's no doubt about it, and I'm very optimistic and positive about the possibilities of that. It's not given that it's going to be good. So in that sense, I suppose the traditionalism point, I'm just slightly ambivalent about, or
yes,
dare I say, dialectical.
Yeah, look, I totally understand why you're ambivalent about that word traditionalist, but I think to be a traditionalist, in my definition of it, would embrace reasonable change. Now, who defines reasonable? Well, it's just when it's submitted to some kind of intellectual cost-benefit analysis, like the HS2 hasn't been submitted to. They've just gone, oh, I think we need a spiffing new railway. Let's just chuck taxpayers' money at it. In the same way, a lot of the currents in politics in the last 20 or 30 years have been, we must embrace change regardless. I mean, that was after all Obama's campaign slogan, hope and change. That change in and of itself was a good thing. And I don't think that's the case. I think sometimes we can look at the past and realise, no, this works. We don't need to change it.
It's interesting as well. I was just thinking about your postmodernism point, or maybe just to use an anecdote because I think it illustrates maybe some of the shared concerns we have. So the University of Birmingham, through a grant on diversity funded by the EPSRC, which is the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, are now appointing, as it were, reverse mentors for professors and eminent academics. And those reverse mentors are to be young students, young academics from ethnic minorities and representing marginalised groups, to teach the professors about their unconscious bias. Now, that story kind of broke over the weekend, and I'm not shocked by many things because it's actually the kind of thing I've been writing about for some time, and yet somehow it chilled me to the bone because this is like a kind of Maoist cultural revolution. And in that sense, I suppose this is where I do sound like a traditionalist, because my view is that the professors, regardless of their ethnicity or their, pale, male and stale, is actually the expression used by this scheme. They might know more, they do know more than their young mentors. But of course, what they don't know is about their own vicious, malevolent, unconscious, deep-seated racism and misogyny, which is implied by this whole scheme, which of course I think is incredibly derogatory, insulting to academics. And I'm not necessarily a great supporter of academics, but just in terms of the topsy-turvy world we live in, how incredible that a research council, an eminent scientific body, would end up in a situation of attacking the source of knowledge and research, the academics, based on these kind of new ideas around power relations that now overthrow them. And in fact, the real power in those relationships in universities now are not actually the professorial insights of, decades of researching and understanding a particular aspect of, for example, physics or history or what have you, but the power to be able to call people out for racism or sexism and so on. And it's interesting because it's a very frightening prospect, because you know that if you're called out in those circumstances, there's nowhere to run, nowhere to go. So, I am a traditionalist from the point of view that I think that professors know more than students, broadly speaking. And also, I really reject one of the aspects of, you call it postmodernism, but the whole kind of post-colonial discourse at the moment, which effectively says that the only way to understand anything is through identity and one's particular characteristics based on ethnicity or gender. And I find that to be a step back. This is kind of feudal England stuff, right? Well, not just England, but, in feudal times, you were a knight, or you were a serf, or you were a lord. You had fixed positions. You knew exactly who you were. You were ordained by birth. You were destined to never move within that. Everybody knew their place. Part of the Enlightenment was the overthrowing of that, with the great possibility that you as an individual agent could be whatever you wanted. And although that had a romanticised aspect, and, fair enough, if you were working in a steel factory in the Industrial Revolution, you might not quite feel as though you were equal. But actually you were, because you, for example, in democratic terms, had exactly the same rights as an aristocrat. And some of these kind of great freeing philosophical insights of the Enlightenment are being overthrown by people who are going back to a pre-modern era and fixing us based on our skin or on the things we've not achieved, by the way. As a woman, I can say as a woman, but I mean, I didn't achieve that. I just am it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's and therefore it actually is the least interesting thing about me.
It's one of the warning signals, isn't it? Anyone begins a letter to a newspaper or on an interview on a TV program as a gay man, as a woman, as a black man. It's a signal they're going to talk rubbish.
Well, it's a signal that they're going to say, I have a right to say this and you don't. You're playing your card that basically silences someone else, because it's always done in the basis of, I have the authority to speak on this based on my identity, versus you who are speaking on it based on possibly empirical information or research or knowledge or just opinion or analysis. But no, that's never enough. You have to play the identity card to get a hearing these days.
Yeah. I think one of the things I find most worrying about this is probably only a hardcore of aggressive social justice warriors who are setting the tone for the whole of our culture. Have you read Vox Day's Social Justice Warriors Always Double Down?
No.
There's a particularly good section at the beginning where he talks about this process called convergence, where every institution gets converged by SJW values, and it's normally a small cadre of activists who infiltrate an institution, usually via human resources. So they're normally the kind of diversity, in charge of diversity or whatever. And when you were talking about that academic council just now, I was thinking about another story I read at the weekend where the Globe Theatre has a guy. It's found some sort of black academic who is put in charge of their education. I mean, why does it's a theatre, for goodness sake? Why isn't it just staging productions? And he has produced this thesis for them, which says that that theatrical lighting is racist and movie set lighting is racist. It's designed for white people rather than black people. So suddenly, it's not enough to have this positive diversity casting that institutions like the RSC and the Globe and the BBC have, but also now they're having race positive lighting. And I was thinking, how is it that a tiny minority of people are suddenly allowed to take an institution and like parasites transform the institution into something it was never meant to be? So what used to be a theatre company suddenly becomes another agency for promoting liberal left values.
Well, I think there's a number of things to untangle there. I mean, first of all, I think it's absolutely right that the sort of infamous social justice warrior, who are a caricature after all. I mean, they don't quite exist beyond people like my own imagination. I mean, they do, but what I'm saying is they're a caricature.
Handy label.
It's a handy label. I'm only saying that because I understand, they appear to be, for people who are less worried about these kind of things, they appear to be this kind of infamous bogey man, woman, that we're not allowed to, bogey person, that we're all kind of, the straw man. God, everything I say now is gendered. Anyway, the point about it is that there is a kind of very small group of people who behave egregiously and beyond caricature.
Yeah.
And I do worry myself about overstating their significance in society. And there is a danger of us kind of over lampooning what is actually a rather small influence. The question you then ask is how these kind of things infiltrate out. Whereas I think that those kind of extreme examples are, actually overstated, and really the media love them and we can all make fun of them. But actually much more significant than that is that there is a widespread, and this is across all political parties and very broadly held by many people in society, two very important and interlinked things. One is that identity politics has emerged as the way that we understand ourselves. So there is an acceptance that if you are a black man, you will understand the racial significance of stage lighting more than a white man or a white woman or what have you. And and people are frightened to kind of challenge that. So it can kind of create a chilling mechanism where you can't sort of say, what are you talking about? That is a nonsense. And I know that I'm a great friend of the Globe Theatre and think it's done some fantastic things theatrically. And I'm sure that there are many people who work there who are sitting there biting their lip thinking, what is this report? This is mad. But anxious and nervous that if they challenge it, they'll somehow be implicated in some kind of racist storm. And that coincides with a very widespread idea that marginal groups, I hate that phrase, but it's the one that's used, marginal groups, what used to be called people who are politically oppressed, i.e. are not given entirely equal treatment, are somehow vulnerable, and that if we that we have to kind of walk on eggshells in relation to dealing with marginal groups, that their mental health is at stake. It's not just that we might hurt their feelings, but that actually everybody is kind of just one offensive comment away from kind of being thrown into some terrible trauma.
Because they're special.
And they're treated differently as a consequence. Yeah. Now, there's been a recent spat here in relation to the former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson in relation to what he wrote about.
We're going to do that in the next section.
But what was just fascinating me was the number of people who'd say, imagine how damaging this is for Muslim women. And it's like, it's an article in the Telegraph. It's not damaging at all. But you have to protect them. And then people say, well, what about how Muslim women feel? And how can he, a white man, talk about it? And that's from Tories. I mean, it's the Conservative Party who've been arguing this. So the reason I say that is because that kind of whole paternalistic, we've got to protect marginalised groups from ideas, and also kind of handing over ideas to people from different identities, that's not social justice warriors doing that. That's now become normalised. That is part and parcel of what politics is like at the moment. And so I think we should kind of almost avoid the kind of more egregious, silly examples that we see in many a university campus, even though I've already used one, and kind of look at how mainstreamed it's become. I don't think it's just because of, I'm sure that HR departments deserve some blame, but I think it's more that it is considered to be common sense that we've lost a belief in either the robustness of people to cope with ideas that they don't agree with, or just things that they find uncomfortable, or and we've also lost a belief in universalism, in the notion that we should treat people equally, and that one's identity is not the defining aspect of who you are.
Yeah. You're listening to the Breitbart podcast by me, James Dellingpole, and with my special guest, Clare Fox. More in a moment.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlow.
Censorship is a key issue here, particularly for people on the right. Do you think it was addressed adequately?
Definitely not. It was useful to name check Diamond and Silk. It was useful to check even politicians who had campaign ads that were shut down. But in every case, Zuckerberg was allowed to essentially dismiss the case and move on.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays at 6 a.m. Eastern on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Dellingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Dellingpole.
Welcome back to the Dellingpole podcast, a Breitbart podcast with me, James Dellingpole, and my very special guest, Clare Fox, my friend who looks like a lesbian, is very left-wing, but actually is totally on my side. Well, more or less, aren't you, Clare? Now, can I just ask you about that point you made about how many conservatives are also on the side against free speech. Now, this seems to me to be a significant divide in our time. That as a right-wing person, I can no longer trust the Conservative Party to do the right thing, and you probably feel very much the same way about the Labour Party. That these parties that used to be about the left and the right don't really represent us anymore.
Absolutely. I mean, if you take an issue like free speech, it's remarkable how so many people have abandoned the field. I mean, you know, people who either on the left, for civil liberties reasons, it was always considered that free speech was about giving a voice to everybody. You know, the demand was free speech for all. If you were a black woman in Birmingham in the past, free speech was the tool through which you would fight for your equality.
Totally.
I mean, that was what every step forward in the fight for women's rights and the fight for decriminalisation of homosexuality, all of these things were fought for under the banner of free speech, and we'll go out and argue and all the rest of it. And on the right, there was a recognition. I mean, you know, you didn't even think of these things as left and right, actually. You thought of them as kind of an authoritarian trend, who were frightened, who were constantly trying to censor, and often that was the state, but you know, then backed by kind of moralists and so on, who thought we shouldn't be trusted. Now, anyway, as we know, the whole issue of free speech has been sadly abandoned, particularly by the left, and actually more and more people on the right. Now, I've got a real problem at the moment. Even doing this podcast will cause me problems. And I mention that because I've noticed some in a row that I was having inevitably on social media, but it's become a very big issue for me, is people will describe free speech as a right-wing trope, right?
Yeah.
And when they say right-wing trope, by the way, they mean alt-right, and they mean far-right, and they mean fascist.
So they mean Nazi, basically.
Basically,
cut to the chase.
It's a delegitimizing thing. And there's been a range of articles recently coming from the left, from my peers on the left, that said all of these people going on about free speech on campus, the likes of whom they say, like Clare Fox and the Academy of Ideas and types like her. It's just an excuse for the Tory party to go in and tell student unions how to behave. It's exaggerated beyond belief. And anyway, have you noticed that free speech is now the preferred vehicle of the likes of white supremacists in America, of Tommy Robinson and his happy band of anti-Islam working class yobs over in the UK, and that's what they say, and that's therefore an attempt at shaming you into silence as a guilt by association. And it gets to the point where you think all the time, you know, as somebody, I'm the director of this wonderful organisation, the Academy of Ideas. I'm on the BBC. I do all these. I run a debating competition for schools, and obviously, I don't want to be called a fascist.
No,
Guess what?
no one does.
Or a racist. No, and you start to think, oh, maybe I ought to steer clear of that topic.
Yeah.
You know, possibly I maybe shouldn't throw myself in to discussing this issue, or to be seen to be being interviewed by James Delingpole. I mean, what will people say? And that's not because of anything other than this slur, which is that, you know, free speech is for the right only, and the right are all dodgy because the right are just a front for fascists. So what's now happened is that the Conservative Party, it seems to me, particularly in Britain, but I think this is an international problem, they're so frightened that they themselves, because they are on the right, will somehow, because they're on the right, be seen to be the alt-right, or to be somehow associated with some of these completely, you know, the vile ideas around white supremacism, for example, in America and so on, panic. And they think, we don't, just the way the Tory party used to think, we don't want to be the nasty party, so we're going to kind of, you know, hug a hoodie, or kind of go all green on climate change, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Now what has happened is that many people who are associated with the right, it seems to me, are so desperate people won't think they're alt-right fascists who just say free speech is a ruse so that they can be bigoted. The right then say, yes, close down that speech because it's offensive. Close down that idea because they're kind of compensating somehow. And I think that that's very dangerous, because what it means is that the space in which one is an advocate of free speech is being squeezed by all sides, and it's making it uncomfortable even to argue for free speech. I mean, it used to be that it was uncomfortable to argue for certain ideas, or to argue against deplatforming or no platforming people whose ideas you didn't agree with. Now, even saying that you're a free speech absolutist with no apology is enough to get you thrown out of polite society.
Have you read the Iliad?
Of course I've read the Iliad.
So do you not feel that we are living in, we've gone back to the age of heroes, where these battles are not being fought by armies anymore? There's a few doughty warriors who go out in front. You know, you're Achilles, I don't know, Hector or Patroclus or somebody, and you can count on, well, not the fingers of one hand, but you can actually make a list of people who go out there and are fearless and say this stuff. You're one of them. Brendan's one of them. Douglas Murray is one of them. Katie Hopkins is one of them. There's a few people out there who just are prepared to take all the shit just because they recognise that somebody needs to be doing this stuff, and they're prepared to accept the personal cost that goes with it.
Okay, so a number of things to come back on that. I mean, I think that there are many more people who actually are sympathetic to the individuals than I mean, I've been gratified, by the way, because I wrote this book, I Find That Offensive, a few years ago, which is a critique of and address to Generation Snowflake. And I really genuinely thought that I was going to come under some hammering, you know. It's
a great book, by the way.
It's just about to be republished this week, in fact, so this is well timed.
Yeah.
Called I Still Find That Offensive, with a new little intro. But actually, I genuinely thought, you know, I'm going to, you know, every young person in the country is going to hate me. You know, middle-aged woman moans about Generation Snowflake. But in fact, what happened is that many young people actually, it was the younger generation that actually really liked the book. It was my own peers who really went for me.
Interesting.
Yes, because actually the book is actually saying that my own peers are responsible for creating this over-coddled generation and so on and so forth. But anyway, I say that because I've done a lot of speeches over the last 2 years now as a consequence of the book at universities, at sixth forms, and I've found an increasing number of young people just being utterly frustrated by the stultifying atmosphere around free speech and feeling themselves that they just aren't able to explore ideas openly, and gratified that there's kind of a bit of a kickback against some of the more censorious trends. So I say that because I think that although there might be some doughty heroes, I shudder to think that I mean, it's great if I am one, but honestly, it shouldn't be like that. But I do think there are millions of people who actually agree with any of us who are arguing for a free and open society in terms of what we talk about. And that's why I think the politicians on all sides who have abandoned this field really misunderstand and misassess the mood. I mean, it's not the first time, but the chasm between the kind of political elite and the mass of people in society is enormous. They just have missed the moment. So they think they're appealing to a group of people by clamping down on things or saying that's too offensive and so-and-so should be silenced or shut up or disciplined or what have you. Whereas actually, they're actually appealing to a much smaller group of people than they realise. Now, the other problem I've got is that because of this kind of abandonment of the free speech arena by, as it were, mainstream politicians and mainstream, I don't just mean political parties, I mean mainstream organisations in general. It's just kind of not, you know,
corporate cowardice.
Yeah, and even civil liberties organisations, you know, just not there when it comes to free speech at the moment. But anyway, when you have that occur, I think it does create a space for some faux free speech warriors to emerge. And I do think, I mean, I find it galling myself that there are people who I consider to be a bit dodgy, who can then claim to be kind of free speech warriors in that space. And I don't blame them, by the way, because it's not their fault that everyone else has abandoned the field. I mean, I can hardly say how dare Tommy Robinson declare himself as the free speech warrior or the free speech hero, the free speech martyr, when there's no one else around. It's not his fault. But on the other hand, I get anxious about that. I also do get anxious about a certain provocateur style intervention in this. So I mentioned that because you mentioned Katie Hopkins, and I'm not her greatest fan. I wouldn't have her silenced or censored anyone listening. But I do think that there's a kind of people who can exploit the kind of outrage market, and I worry about that. I feel as though that's a trap one should avoid.
But isn't it a bit like Alex Jones, for example? I mean, I listen to, and I'm sure most people are the same, I can listen to an Alex Jones show and listen to some of the points he makes and goes, well, he's right on climate change. I mean, it is a kind of leftist conspiracy, you know, the whole shebang. But when he's talking about 9/11 conspiracy theories, I go, oh, there he goes on one of his wacky things. But it doesn't mean that I feel that he should be silenced. I think people are intelligent enough to make their own minds up.
Oh, I agree. And that's why I was saying I'm not trying to close those down. What I'm saying is that when everybody else has failed to fight for free speech, then it does give people like Alex Jones...
Sure.
Katie Hopkins, she's not the same as Alex Jones, but, it kind of gives them room. One thing about the InfoWars issue, though, that really makes me laugh is there's a guy who most people consider to be a bit of a wacko when it comes to conspiratorial thinking, because he really does think the establishment's out to get him. And then everybody lobbies the major tech giants to close him down, and they do, which basically proves his very point. I mean, goodness sake.
Yes.
If anything's going to fuel his conspiratorial thinking, it's turning him into an international pariah, depriving him of all bases on which he can speak. And that will increase his support.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no doubt about it. And that's why my biggest dread is that the more that people... I mean, I think anyone should listen to anything. The more I've ever... I've only listened to InfoWars a few times, but every time I've listened to it, I've been so underwhelmed and underimpressed that I haven't bothered listening to it. But I'm, like you, agree that one should listen widely or read widely and make your own mind
And
up.
it has given us Paul Joseph Watson, who is a personal hero of mine. I love his vidcasts.
I'm not so much of a fan.
You don't have to.
No, but that's the point. The point about it is that we don't have to be fans of anyone, right? We can... And I suppose one of the things that's fascinating for me is that there's just on InfoWars and conspiratorial thinking, there's a fascinating kind of thing going on at the moment where there's a lot of people who are attacking, for example, the satirist and actor and comedy performer Jonathan Pye.
Yes.
That's co-written by Andrew Doyle, who's a brilliant stand-up comedian and also a writer, writes plays, and is kind of genuinely...
And future podcast guest, don't you worry.
Genuine, and fascinating, so that's good. But anyway, the reason I'm saying that is because Jonathan Pye is an absolute lefty, much more conventionally lefty than I am, but acts out a character that actually really, really, really hammers home some of these points about the more egregious aspects of social justice warrioring... I couldn't even say the word, and it's very pro-free speech. And of course, inevitably, people have managed to link him to Alex Jones and fascism and right-wing thinking. I mean, I read some things over the last week or so that are so conspiratorial thinking that I think the people who wrote them should actually be, auditioning for InfoWars because they do rather well. I mean, the way that people cannot accept, and this is why I think we have to take people as is, without being naive. I don't wish to appear to be completely clueless on these questions, but my view is that now I read and listen to things without thinking, A, who funds them, or B, where do they get these ideas from, or who are they connected to? I try and take the ideas. I mean, I run the Academy of Ideas.
That's very old-fashioned.
It's the ideas that matter.
Yeah.
And do I agree with that idea or not that idea? And in that regard, even though I've been rather dismissive of Katie Hopkins, there are things she said I've agreed with, and there are many things she said that I disagree with. I don't like her style, and even though I'm actually accused of being a provocateur on occasion, that's usually just because I'm not going along with the conformist thinking. But I don't actually like kind of provocateurism for the sake of it.
You have a different style, let's say. Can I float an idea past you? Which is that I think that secretly we are in the majority. And not just a small majority either. I think we're the vast majority. And I think... I was having a chat about this with a fellow conservative in America. And as you know, the conservative movement in America has been divided, rather like it has been by Brexit over here. In the US, it's been divided between never-Trumpers, who think that Trump is an embarrassment to Republican cause and conservatism, and people like me and people like the chap I was talking to yesterday, who think, actually, no, Trump has put his finger on something. And I think, I don't know, without asking you whether you're a massive Trump fan or not, like I am, but I think that one of the reasons that Trump is doing so well and why he won the vote is that precisely that issue of political correctness and free speech, that he's tapped into the majority's disgust and discomfort and loathing of this war on our freedom to say what we want and behave in our own private ways without the oppressive offence police coming down on us.
I am not a fan of Trump, but I think that the ridiculous way that people have reacted and responded to Trump's election has indicated a complete lack of understanding of what American politics has become like. And I had every sympathy with anyone who would vote to keep Hillary out. I think that she treated people with total contempt in that election, and she deserved to take a hammering in a metaphorical electoral sense. The thing that I think that's funny about Trump, actually, is a bit of a snowflake. I mean, he's not great taking criticism himself, but his disruptive qualities, the fact that he's not him, but the fact that he doesn't play by the rule book, as in traditional politics, when it comes to diplomacy, economic affairs, or the fact that he kind of just wades around, I don't necessarily think is a great... I think that he can be immature as a politician, let's put it that way. But what's fascinating is why people like him, and I understand this, is because he just says... we're not playing by the old rules that somebody else has imposed on us. And I've got a lot of sympathy with that. And that was why I was saying to you before about changes in the air. People kind of want change.
Totally.
People are fed up of this. I think there is a majority of people who are kind of fed up and, kind of like wanting to throw off the shackles. And I mean, goodness, you only have to look at what's happening to politics in not just the Anglo-American world, but the European countries, where all sorts of parties that nobody ever heard of a few years ago are suddenly kind of coming top of the opinion polls, never mind getting people elected. All sorts of traditional parties are absolutely collapsing in on themselves, got nothing to say. To notice that there is a genuine kind of upsurge, a kind of anti-establishment upsurge.
Yes.
It doesn't necessarily know where it's going, which of course is the confusing bit. And sometimes some of the movements can appear to be, I don't like them. I worry about them being verging on being racist in some instances, but often they are written off as racist xenophobes when they aren't. They're just simply challenging certain things which they've been told they have to accept. There's kind of like, I've had debates with people where they've said, Italy's been taken over by the fascists. You wouldn't know a fascist if you fell over one, if you think that's what's going on. Hungary is obviously run by fascists now, according to the script.
Look at Matteo Salvini, for example. I mean, he's been... If you actually live in Italy and you've seen your country being raped by the central bankers of the EU, and you've seen the middle class's standard of living just actually hasn't increased. It's probably fallen in the last 15, 20 years. And you see all these people landing on your beaches and being rejected in the interior of Europe. So you're just a basically kind of dumping ground for all these people who want all these migrants. You're not going to look at Matteo Salvini when he says, actually, we're not going to have any more of this, and go, well, he's a fascist, he's a racist. You're going to be thinking, thank God, somebody finally gets me and my needs.
Exactly, because the point about the kind of rather high-handed and haughty and patronising view from many British left commentators in relation to what's happening in Italy is to say, how can you be so... vile about immigrants, but and there are, by the way, lots of things that are said in relation to immigrants in Italy, which are pretty insulting and gross, and I don't like myself. But you have to understand, as you've just described, what's been going on in Italy, right? And we don't have to deal with that in the same way here. So there's absolutely, ironically, no empathy with the peoples of Europe.
No.
So all of the people who are kind of so keen on the EU, so keen on being European, why don't you want to be European? Well, I want to be European, I just don't want to be in the EU. But they're the very people who've got no insight and no knowledge, actually, of the kind of terrible living conditions that people are in, or any sense of the history of those countries. Like, take Hungary, for example. I mean, Hungary's borders have never been their own for many, many years. I mean, they've constantly been invaded by other countries. Constantly, those borders have been infringed upon historically. They've never almost had their own sovereignty. And now you have a government that says, we will look after our borders. And we go, fascist.
Yeah.
Right? Instead of going, possibly, they were a vassal state for too many years, and now they have some pride and dignity. I'm not a great supporter of the Hungarian government, for millions of reasons. But it's just that to not even understand what's going on drives me mad. One thing, slightly separately, but if I can just mention though, although I believe that there are millions of people who are kind of really fed up and so on the free speech issue, there is one thing that makes me realise that there's an aspect of the free speech issue where I don't think that my arguments are penetrating through, which is that more and more, particularly young people, do see themselves as having a particular vulnerability and kind of fragility when it comes to hearing unpleasant things or hearing words
Yes.
or hearing certain points. And I think we can't underestimate that. I think there's a real problem when you have a kind of epidemic of young people declaring themselves as in need of mental health treatment, and they are being incited to do so. I mean, there's no doubt about that we have basically, as a society, socialised the young into seeing all of the problems that they face through the prism and the language and the rhetoric of mental health and therapeutic interventions. And the problem is that this becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I noticed, or I don't know if you did, that the Conservative Universities Minister,
Oh my God! Yes.
Sam Gyimah, has basically said the purpose of university should predominantly be equally divided between academic attainment, but more significant, he said, was students' well-being, and all of his focus is now going to be on students' mental health. So, the abandonment of the role of a university, over to a kind of therapeutic, kind of over-coddled safe space, and in a way, this is very insulting to people who are mentally ill. I mean, we should remember that if you're mentally ill, which is the most devastating condition, I worked with the mentally ill for some years many years ago, and so I'm completely abhorred by the fact that now everyone can say that they're mentally ill, that actually the provisions that are given over to the mentally ill are now being divided amongst ever greater numbers because of a kind of concept creep and an over-pathologized, medicalized definitions of exam stress as being the equivalent of schizophrenia or something. I mean, it's a real tragedy. And I do think that is really problematic for young people, and it means that they are not able to cope with things they don't like hearing. And so that's one of the reasons why things do get closed down.
Clare Fox, you are way too fluent and too interesting on too many topics. You're listening to the Dellingpole podcast, a Breitbart podcast with me, James Dellingpole. More in a moment.
Breitbart News Tonight with Joel Pollack and Rebecca Mansour.
I said that it's the epitome of hypocrisy. Unless you fall in line with their liberal agenda, this uniparty, globalist, liberal agenda, they will never support you. They use the whole gender issue, of course, as some kind of tool to prop up their messaging, but it's the phoniest thing.
Sirius XM Patriot Channel 125.
This is Dellingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Dellingpole.
This is a Breitbart podcast with me, James Dellingpole, and my very special guest, Clare Fox. Clare, we've got to talk about the topic of the moment, Boris Johnson and the burqa. So we've got this ridiculous situation, haven't we, in Britain, whereby Boris Johnson wrote a column in which he made a mildly critical remark, just a jocular remark about this I think what a lot of us would consider oppressive medieval garb with probably no justification in the Islamic texts. And yet he's being pilloried for this. What's your take on that?
It is so interesting, isn't it? Because he wrote an article for The Telegraph, which was actually an attack on Denmark for betraying its own liberal traditions and its attachment to liberty by banning the burqa. So this was largely the focus of the article.
I don't want the burqa banned.
I do not think the burqa should be banned anywhere.
Yeah.
And Denmark, you've made a mistake, can I say to you?
Yeah.
He also said that he thought it was very important in a free society that women should be able to wear what they want without interference. Well, you wouldn't have thought he'd said either of those things, because he also went on to say, I don't think that the burqa or the niqab should be banned. However, I don't like those garments. In fact, I think they're oppressive. And he then used his letterbox analogy, simile, and then said about the bank robbers. Now, what do I make of this? I mean, I think there's a number of things to be said. The issue has been jumped upon by a range of people for opportunistic reasons, which has really confused things. I mean, we've had a combination of people leaping on the bandwagon in relation to the Brexit Remain camp. So he's kind of been kind of called out by his opponents who, want Remain or soft Brexit in relation to the EU, of all things. He's not fit to be a Tory leader, so the whole of the Conservative Party's got embroiled in this conversation as though that's what this was about. Everybody has assumed his motives are malign. I've got no idea. I'm really, genuinely not a Boris fan in general, politically, although I thought this article was fine. But this idea that, because again, it's conspiratorial thinking, he met Steve Bannon, and Steve Bannon rules the world secretly from some of these, this is what they're saying.
From a volcano. Have you heard that?
And that he is gathering together and so on. And so Boris Johnson has been influenced by Steve Bannon and has dropped these two phrases into an article 3/4 of the way down, even though it's about Denmark. I mean, it wasn't exact. I mean, it's so subtle you'd hardly notice. And that's because this is a fascist takeover. One commentator, Matthew Dancona, has actually written an article saying that this article is as significant as the Rivers of Blood speech by Enoch Powell. That's the heading. And of the article by Matthew Dancona. What are we talking about? So you've got that going on. You've then also got a deflection, which is that the Labour Party are inevitably being torn apart by its own rows in relation to anti-Semitism, and here comes along an opportunity to say that Tories are all Islamophobic. So in a way, you can see how that kind of opportunism plays out. And so there's those kind of like more superficial reasons why this is blown up. But I think much more profoundly and much more depressingly and significantly for us is that there is a situation now where people are able to say that anyone who queries any aspect of Muslim religion or lifestyle is Islamophobic. And it's so ironic because actually the people who are leading the attacks on the wearing of the burqa and niqab internationally are Muslim women and are feminists of all sorts who say this is an oppressive garb and so on. But of course, that's where we go back to identity politics, because it's also said, well, that's okay. They're allowed to say it. But if you're a white, Tory, posh, Eton-educated politician, you're not allowed to say it. Even though, in fact, actually, he was saying it, as I say, he was actually attacking Denmark, not women in burqas. He was just making that as an aside point. So you can see all these things unravelling, and I am very worried about the absolute feeding frenzy that's happened in relation to this. People will then say that his article, and what people are saying, that his article has led to the rise in hate crime on the streets. Now, hate crime is so broadly defined that what this appears to amount to is that there have been people going around saying to women wearing niqabs and burqas throughout Britain, you look like a bank robber or a letterbox, which is not very nice. It's a very unpleasant thing to do, very rude. Why would you do that? But it's not quite the kind of anti-Muslim pogrom that it's being portrayed as. No. And also, by the way, it's reported as. But, of course it's not very nice. But then you might think, well, where did the people who are going around calling people letterboxes and bank robbers get the idea from? Because are they all Telegraph readers who go behind the paywall and have read it? No. They've got it because there's been such a furore against the article by all these people whipping up this idea that there's Islamophobic thing. But the problem is that people are now saying you write an article and this will lead to racist attacks. Whereas in fact it's a much more complicated, first of all, they're not racist attacks, but secondly, where there is a kind of like reaction is because this has been the talking point for the media for the last week, headline hysteria. And I wrote an article for Quillette on the issue at the end of last week, and I've taken some stick, like everybody. I mean, I can cope with that. I only say that because, again, it's unpleasant. I wrote an article trying to explain what Boris's article was all about, and immediately I'm an Islamophobe.
Where did you take the stick?
Oh, on social media,
in the
of course.
comments section.
Comments section, social media. But a lot of people have reposted it, so it's come back on me in a range of ways. It doesn't matter to me, but what it does have the impact of is of chilling discussion, doesn't it? Because you then suddenly think, oh, you're not allowed to say anything about certain topics, and that makes me nervous.
In the context of your excellent book, which you must plug again, I still find that offensive. I want to expand that out a bit from the narrow issue of Boris and talk about one of the things that really troubles me about the way that the SJWs operate, which is that they focus on single sentences like Boris's thing about letterboxes, or even not even a phrase, and they strip it of all context and intent, so that. And you saw this, for example, with the way that the left used the sort of Antifa and Black Lives Matter and Occupy, that crowd. They focused relentlessly on what Trump had said in the context of the Charlottesville thing. I don't think anyone really believes that Donald Trump supports white supremacists, that he supports the far right. And yet for the Owen Joneses of this world, for the Antifas, that he said something, by condemning both sides and refusing to acknowledge that everyone on the right was evil, he therefore proved himself to be a fascist. And this is something I've noticed going on an awful lot, that kids are now emerging from university incapable of doing the most basic critical thinking. Are this person's intentions good? Does the context in which they said this allegedly offensive remark actually show that the remark is less offensive than they're making it out to be?
Well, it's actually interesting that you should describe that point about critical thinking, because I too have become very concerned. I mean, I used to teach English literature, largely at a further education college, a variety of further education colleges. So, to some young people who were not necessarily going to go on to be literary dons, but, we were introducing them to literature. And what you were always trying to do was to get people to understand, with a bit more depth than just reading something through, what something meant, and I don't mean by that to be trying to detect power relations and unconscious bias, but actually to really kind of put things into context and to understand them and to think about them. That's what, a real appreciation of ideas is all about, isn't it? And that just doesn't happen so much now. I mean, I was very shocked in relation to the Boris issue, and we can go on, that very few people that I was engaging with in relation to it had read his argument or his article, because they kept telling me that it was terrible that Boris was trying to ban the burqa, which, as we know, he wasn't arguing that. And they obviously seemed... So they hadn't even read an article. But just trying to kind of just read things and think about them and be calm when you're reading them and try and work out what's going on is very unfashionable. The context issue is so important, isn't it? There was that terrible incident... I can't remember whether it was earlier this year or not, with Count Dankula, the sort of the YouTube prankster who taught his girlfriend's pug to do a Nazi salute, a joke. And the significant point about context was the Scottish courts actually proclaimed that context did not matter, that he had actually taught the dog to do a Nazi salute and said, a phrase, I quote now, "gas the Jews" to the dog. And therefore that phrase, out of context, was him being a racist, hate criminal.
Yep.
Now, as many comics who supported him said, well, if if context means nothing, then all comedy is dead. I mean, you could not, and I mean, luckily Rowan Atkinson has come to the support of Boris Johnson.
Good old Mr. Bean.
Indeed, to make the point that, if you can't make it some off, even if it's not an off colour kind of comment, not necessarily that's sort of witty or funny. Are we going to sort of go around sanitising all comedy? And of course, at the moment, that's where we're going.
Yeah. And
it seems that the inability to accept that things are said in context is very important. And by the way, I think this is equally applies. I mean, it's actually rather daft for Owen Jones et al. To play this game, because there are times when things that Jeremy Corbyn has said, or things which people in the Labour Party have said that are now being dubbed anti-Semitic. There is a lot of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, don't get me wrong. Yeah. But all I'm saying is there are other things that are just taken out of context. And I am no more sympathetic to the right doing a tit for tat. You said this, he said that. I mean, by the time you finish, you just end up going mad. And I therefore think that you're right that lack of analysis does exist. There's just one other interesting thing. There's a newly, actually an analysis of the use of trigger warnings in universities, which obviously it always seems like a bit of a joke. Why are people like me, Clare Fox, making a big fuss about trigger warnings when they're just simply just a question of a university academic saying you might hear descriptions of sexual violence in the Iliad or what have you. Well, actually, this report that's just come out has indicated that the use of trigger warnings has led to a lower threshold by which people are offended. So they actually showed people, anyway, I won't go into it, it's a scientific report, it's worth looking at. And I say that because actually there's more and more institutionalised devices to stop context ever being discussed. Can you imagine anything more unlikely than trigger warnings in relation to literature?
Yes.
When you sort of say, you might encounter sexual violence or bullying or misogyny or racism in these novels, you think, that's the least of it. Are you seriously telling me that we need to tell people that Madame Bovary's got, domestic, potentially abusive behaviour in relation to women, when in fact it's a rich novel resonant of all of the ideas of every part of civilization. It's a fantastically important novel. And it can't be reduced to a trigger warning.
No.
And I think that is what has happened, is we reduce our analysis of articles to headlines or sound bites or what somebody else has tweeted instead of actually reading it and thinking it.
Which is why I worry, I worry about the entirety, actually, of the arts degree establishment now. I mean, are there any arts courses? I hope so. I mean, I hope they still have them at Durham, which is where my boy's going. But I actually, the other day, I actually sat down with my daughter and told her not to apply to, or urged her not to apply to Oxbridge. And previously, I mean, it would have been a father's greatest wish that his girl should go to. But they're over.
I'm less sympathetic to your views on this. I think that you're broadly right about the trajectory of a lot of courses at universities, particularly the humanities. That's true. However, one of the things that saves them is that many of the students who go to study, for example, whether it's English literature or German literature or philosophy or whatever, they themselves are passionate about their subjects. And there's a kind of clash between academics. There's a kind of orthodoxy now. There's a kind of post-structuralist orthodoxy that hates literature,
yes,
usually espoused by those who teach it.
Yeah.
But there are also many people in the departments who love literature as well. And so what happens is there's a kind of a struggle that goes on. And so I think that there are still many people who are being taught brilliantly by lots of brilliant, academics to appreciate the subjects they're studying. But the orthodox positions, the new orthodox positions, you're absolutely right. I mean, I fear that that's the thing, which is, I remember having an argument with some students who were telling me about that I didn't understand Jane Austen's novels, and they might have been right, other than that they were telling me that you could only understand Jane Austen's novels if I understood what wasn't written, what wasn't there in relation to slavery. And I could only understand them if I read different letters by people and correspondence and so on. And I said, well, what about reading the novels? I mean, I just think it's fair point to read the novels as novels, and then you can deconstruct away once you've done that. And then I realised that there was a kind of deadness behind the eyes in a way. And I realised that actually I don't think they'd read the novels. I mean, that might be an overstatement, but they weren't really engaging with me about the novels. They were engaging with me about why it was wrong for me to defend the novels, because this was a woman who we know was really pro-slavery because she didn't write about it in her novels.
Yeah, I think she should be banned, and we should study, heaven knows, colonial literature, which is much more valuable. So, I want to end on a note of hope, because you run this wonderful thing called the Institute of Ideas, and I try to go to your debates every year, if I'm invited, and they're just about ideas, aren't they? They're not branded left or right. But you get quite a good crowd of young people eager to be exposed to people like Camille Pallier, who I didn't see and I was so desperate to see, but her show was completely sold out. But it seems to me that that offers us hope, that your thing attracts people.
Yeah, I think we've both hinted at the fact that we know that there's a real appetite out there for, counterintuitive thinking to the present ways of seeing things. I mean, there is definitely people who are keen to think about ideas and to go against what they're told is the only right answer today. They kind of think to themselves, well, I'm not a racist, but I'm worried about, I might have some concerns about somebody wearing a burqa or a niqab. What do I do? Well, you come to the Battle of Ideas and you explore and debate it. We have this festival every year for, and we get well over 3,500 people now over the course of the weekend. They come for most of the weekend, so come along, everybody. And 100 panel debates. It's definitely not left and right. It really is a sort of an attempt at saying anything from the economy to the environment to whatever is open for discussion. So the hope is there. The audience is the hope. But we have to be ever vigilant. I mean, I suppose that's the thing is that there's a fight here. There's a real fight. The culture wars has come to the UK. Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, America.
And thank you, America. Yeah. And it's well and truly here. And it's not going to just kind of go away by us making fun of people or whatever. We have to be prepared to engage in the arguments and the discussions. And we have to be prepared to listen to people we don't agree with and take on board what they're saying and think about it and engage with them on what they say rather than what we imagine they would say. But we've decided to close them down and not listen.
Yeah. Hear, Claire. I still love you, even though you're, lefty.
That's very kind, James.
You're listening to a Breitbart podcast with me, James Dellingpole, the Dellingpole podcast as it's known, and my very special, lovely guest, Clare Fox, author of I Still Find That Offensive and boss woman
of the Academy of Ideas.
The Academy of Ideas, which organises the Institute of Ideas, is that right?
The Institute of Ideas no longer exists because we are not to be called an institute anymore.
Oh, some wanky rule, right? Okay, Academy of Ideas, right. Anyway, thank you everyone for listening. Bye-bye.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson.
I want to actually take a couple of the references to Donald Trump from hip-hop. And then we're going to try to see if we can figure out why they like Donald Trump. Jay-Z said, I'm at the Trump International. Ask for me. Raekwon said, I'm the black Trump. They are comparing themselves to what he represents. His wealth, his achievement. Capitalism.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson. Saturday from 1 to 3 p.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.